Okay, tonight we will be discussing the book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World by Aaron Wessman. I'm Lee Anderson, the meeting host. And I'd like at this time to introduce our library team who brings you this event and just ask them to wave their hand when I name them. Barbara Reagan and Dan Hardy. And Edward Strickland is not on camera, but he is here with us also. Barbara and Dan are also participant managers and will be helping manage our session. And a very warm welcome to Father Aaron Wessman, author of tonight's book. For some of you, this may be your first experience with Braver Angels, and we're delighted that you joined us and hope that tonight will encourage you to learn more and become involved with our mission. So what is our mission? Well, if you are heartsick about the rancor tearing our country apart, if you believe that your opponents should not be your enemies, if you believe that America's best days can lie ahead, then join our legion of Americans who believe that the fight to save our nation begins with a ceasefire among ourselves. We invite you to become a member of America's largest organization that brings together conservatives and progressives, secular and religious, on equal terms to understand our differences, find common ground where it exists, and help our country, the country we all love, find a better way. So our agenda tonight is pretty simple. There will be a presentation by Father Wessman, who will touch on themes from the book. And then we'll go to a question and answer period for all. And then we'll have a wrap up and at the end of the hour. And there would be, I'll say, there'll be a chance at network time for you to actually share information if you wish to develop contacts among people in the audience. Okay, let me check on one little thing here. Okay, good. Father Aaron Wessman is a priest of the Roman Catholic Church. He is Vicar General and Director of Formation for the Glen Mary Home Missioners. He has a PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, in systematic theology. The religious order he belongs to, Glen Mary, conducts mission in rural, poor, and non-Catholic areas of the United States, primarily in the Southeast and Appalachia. And with that, Father Wessman, would you please take it away?
Great. Thank you so much, Lee, and to the rest of the library team. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much for taking the time and listening to this presentation. I'm going to just take a moment here and share my screen for a little bit of a presentation. All right, very good. So the first thing I just wanted to say is that to be connected into Braver Angels in order to give this presentation is truly an honor for me. I've kind of been in and around Braver Angels for the last number of years, and particularly this summer, I had the opportunity to go to the Braver Angels National Convention in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And, you know, of course, I'm writing about the theme of polarization, but I'm not as often as I would want to really kind of stepping into settings where I'm able to kind of be in a context to sort of bridge the divides. And I was amazed by the experience in Gettysburg. So there was somehow around 700 people there, and half were sort of blue leaning and half were red leaning. And there were a number of us who were kind of either unaffiliated or independent. And it was kind of the most politically diverse setting I had ever been in my whole life. And to see a setting like that and to be part of that was just really moving and inspirational. And not only was it like politically diverse, but it was also racially diverse and religiously diverse. And just to share a little short story about it. So I'm not a morning person at all. It takes like 10 gallons of coffee for me to get going in the morning, right? So you'd have to go to the common place to get breakfast together. And it was usually before I had my coffee. So I'd get my plate and get my coffee and I'd sit down, and I had 3 breakfasts there, right? And the first day I sat down and introduced myself to the people who were sitting there because I didn't know anybody. And the person I was sitting next to was an atheist. The next day I sat down, the person was somebody who self-identified as a Wiccan person. And then the final day that I sat down, the person I sat next to was somebody who said, I really have a hard time with priests. But the thing that was really fascinating about this is that in every one of those experiences, we got sufficient amount of coffee in our systems, and we just started to dialogue. We started to share our stories. We began to build relationships. We really learned about each other. And it was an amazing setting for me, because I think that's really what Braver Angels is all about. And so, again, it's really an honor for me to be here with you all, to be connected with Braver Angels, and to have a chance to talk about the book that I wrote, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World. So my presentation this evening is titled Catholicism and Polarization, Bridging Resources. And I'm going to speak about Christianity in general, but more specifically about Catholicism, because that's the tradition that I hail from. It's the one I'm most comfortable speaking from, though I will have things to say, I think, about Christianity in general in relationship to polarization. So to give you a little bit of a outline about what I hope to do. So really it's 3 parts to this short presentation. The first, I'm going to offer just a few personal remarks regarding my own relationship to the theme of polarization, my own interest in this theme. I'm going to look specifically at my book and how the book is structured, and then pivot to the final theme, which is really to take a look at sort of the relationship between Catholicism and polarization, both things that we maybe have to challenge and perhaps things that we need to, or that we're able to sort of hold up and hold up as important resources. So why is polarization a personal journey for me? I say this to folks when I've been talking a lot on this subject, that I do not stand outside the fray. I definitely am somebody who struggles with division, struggles with the feelings related to polarization too. So the study of this has really been a personal journey for me. So going back all the way to 2014, the community that I belong to, Glenmary, sent me over to Belgium, to the Catholic University of Louvain, as Lee mentioned, and this is the library that you can see pictured in front of you. And it was really amazing to go over to Europe and to study theology. Being in Europe really provided me an opportunity to see European culture and kind of getting engaged in what was going on there. And being in Belgium specifically is wonderful. If you have a chance, go. First of all, they have waffles that, the most wonderful waffles you can ever find, drenched in chocolate. They have the most wonderful chocolate you can ever taste. And believe it or not, they have beer. So if you're a beer drinker, you really want to go to Belgium and try it. Now, I promise I didn't have too much. I just tried a little bit, right? So really a great thing. Belgian beer, they've been brewing these recipes of beer for hundreds and hundreds of years, brought to you by the Catholic Church, of course. But while I was in Belgium, I really had a reprieve from the cultural situation that was taking place in the United States. And then in 2017, my community asked me to come back to the United States to get assigned to a place in Eastern North Carolina. And I see a couple of my former parishioners are on this webinar this evening, so I really have to behave, of course. But I returned back to the States and took a time as a pastor and finished my dissertation. And at that time, I really noticed that something had changed in the US. And it was clearly evident to me. And what was that? Well, there seemed to be, at least how I felt, a deepened sense of hostility and tension and division and overall polarization. It seemed to be happening everywhere, and I saw it in my own family, right? In ways that disturbed me and touched me to the heart, because these are my family members who I didn't often see kind of sharing particular posts on social media like they were sharing, and perhaps saying things in group chats. And that was disturbing to me. I also saw this division taking place even within the church, within Christians. I heard from my friends who were priests and ministers, and they would say, whole groups of people would be leaving their churches, leaving their parishes because they had a falling out with another group of people. And I saw this, of course, somewhat in my own Glenmary community that I belonged to, as we sort of struggled with what was going on at that time. And to be quite honest, like I mentioned, I was sucked down into this. I was sucked down into this as well. And I wondered, what in the world is going on? And so I set myself really to take up this theme to try to understand what had happened in the United States. So I started to study the theme of polarization more as a hobby than anything else. And then little by little, people asked me to talk about this theme, and I gave retreats and gave different talks. And then somewhere along the way, somebody said to me, Father, you should really think about writing a book on this theme, because I really appreciate what you have to say. You've really touched my heart with some of your thoughts and your contributions. So I put myself to what I consider to be a real labor of love. Writing this book was a matter of thinking about this theme for my family, for my church, and also for myself. So as I was writing on the theme of polarization, I was invited to a deeper conversion, a deeper sense of looking at my own life and changing the way I was relating to the cultural situation around me. So I put forth those thoughts in the book, The Church's Mission in a Polarized World, something that I'll have a chance to share about with you today. The book really is broken down into two main parts. And the first part of the book takes a look at, as much as I could, the sociological, the political scientific, the psychological, and the philosophical research to really answer the question, what is polarization? Now, I'm presuming that for many people who are on this call this evening, that's something they're quite familiar with, the developments over the last 5 or 6 decades, how we've gotten to the place where we are today. So I'm not going to touch on that theme as much as I would in other presentations, but for those who are interested, I think that part of the book provides a good synthesis of as much of the research that's out there right now on the main themes around how we've come to be polarized. So I look at sorting, homogenization, and then what I call intensification. And then what I do in the second half of the book is I sort of pivot. I pivot to take a look at the relationship between Christianity and polarization. And I have to be honest that this was challenging for me to do. And when people have read the book, particularly those that come from the Christian background, the Catholic background, some of this was difficult for them to hear. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a confession as a priest. Maybe you haven't heard too many priests give confessions before, but I'd like to give a little confession. So the first thing is, it is very emotional, and it was for me, to critique something that I know others love, namely to critique the church. And I've had people push back, but I've had a lot of people say, yes, we need to ask the tough questions about ourselves as Catholics and as Christians. And so to offer this kind of critique, I think, is something necessary. And so I try to do that as gently as I possibly can in the book. I also think that there's a great paradox out there, and it's kind of somewhat of a tragic paradox. I actually think that Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, has resources to provide to help us out of this difficult situation that we're in. But sadly, I think, and I'll speak for Catholicism, Catholics at times are really part of the problem. Not only are Catholics affected by the overall culture, and so they're polarized, but they're also contributing to polarization. So what I'd like to do in the remainder of this presentation is really hold up two different things. The first I'd like to offer is resources that I think Christianity has to provide to help us depolarize, or to help us build unity, or what we might call theologically to deepen communion. Now, on the other hand, what I want to do is to show how those resources harmonize with much of the research being done, we might call the secular research being done around the theme of polarization. So both are finding a harmony together. So I try to highlight that in the book. To say it again, I recognize that a number of the people who perhaps are part of this discussion this evening might not be part of the Christian background, and I respect that, and might not even be that familiar with Christianity. So what I'd like to do is to sort of raise up some of the things I think Christianity offers for us to help us in our situation, and then show that actually these resonate with a lot of the research in what I call the science of polarization. And then on the other hand, and oftentimes I'm speaking to many Christian audiences, I try to say to them, so we have many resources in our own tradition, but it's good that we also pay attention to what's being written and said by people who are maybe not part of that Christian tradition, because they also have a lot to share with us, like the psychologists, the political scientists, the sociologists, for instance. So my task this evening then is to kind of bridge resources, right? I'm saying that word in two ways, to sort of bring together these resources from different traditions that can help us to be bridging people. What does that look like? Well, to begin, I think one of the most important things that we find in the Christian tradition, in the Catholic tradition, is this whole idea of the examination of conscience. So what is that? In a sense, it's where we kind of come before God and the tradition we received, and we really ask that question, how do I need to change with the help of God? And so all throughout the book that I wrote, especially the third chapter, I'm asking these tough questions for Christians. It's an examination of conscience. How am I contributing to polarization? How have I become polarized? How is my social media presence perhaps deepening divisions? How are my interactions with my family members deepening divisions? How do I need to change my own life in order to live as I'm being called as a Christian? You see, I think this bridges quite well with something that's very common within Braver Angels. And many of us have probably come across this, and it's what they call depolarizing within. I love it. It's to say the first step in undoing polarization or deepening unity is to sort of take a look at myself, take a look at my language, take a look at how I perhaps make others of people, maybe how I generalize, but to do the hard work interiorly myself. So one of the things I think that Christians really need to examine, and we can talk about this a little bit more if we have time, and I cover this in a whole chapter in the book, is the Christian usage of the culture war mentality, the culture war mentality. I'm not dealing in the book with specific issues, but what I argue in the book is that this war mentality, the language around war, arguments referencing war, when we engage in the sort of political, kind of cultural, religious, so-called battle, is really undermining our ability as Christians to live the gospel that Jesus desires us to live. In a sense, I'm saying Christians really need to take a look at this. And I use a lot of examples within that chapter to ask us, should we not change and really get back to the basics of Christianity? Have we wandered away from the core of Christianity? So after we kind of examine our conscience, the next step is to sort of, for us as Christians, really look at the example of Jesus, because we, as many know, we try to form our lives around Jesus, and he is like the example par excellence. So what do we see when we begin to look at Jesus himself? And the first thing that we see, which I develop in the book, is what I call a theology of crossing over. And basically, this is what it means. Jesus, throughout his entire ministry, would identify the other, the outcast, the marginalized person, and rather than destroy them, rather than keep distance, rather than avoid them, rather than talk bad about them, he crossed over to them. He physically went next to them and stood in solidarity with them, even when it was to his own detriment or to the fact that other people will be judging him negatively. So a number of examples. I love art. I love paintings. Here's a painting of Jesus crossing over to the leper, right? Lepers during Jesus's time were outcasts. They were shunned by society. It would have been a horrible existence to be a leper. They would have been ostracized. But Jesus broke that cultural pattern and crossed over to the leper in order to bring life to that situation. Another example, we hear this in several of the Christian writings, what we call the Gospels. So it's the story of the demoniacs, the person so-called possessed by a demon, right? We might think of our own political others as demons, right? Well, Jesus went down the path that everybody else would avoid to cross over, to be in contact with the demon, the demoniac, in order to bring life to that situation. And then the final example of Jesus crossing over, and there are many of them that we could talk about, is that Jesus would often go to the people during his time who were qualified as the so-called sinners of the time. And he would cross over to where they were in person to listen to them, to dialogue with them. And oftentimes he called them in those moments to follow him. And this is the example of Caravaggio's painting of Jesus calling Matthew the tax collector. Now, one of the great things I think about this is that Jesus's crossing over matches what a lot of sociologists and psychologists call contact theory. Contact theory. Many people will be familiar with this. I came across this in the work of Adam Grant. He's got a wonderful book called Think Again. Adam Grant and others say one of the most successful ways for us to undo prejudice and bias is to cross over, to be in person next to those who perhaps we misunderstand, perhaps we have a bias against, perhaps that we even dislike. One of the best ways, and research has showed this over and over again, is to contact them, to be in touch with them. That way we're able to deepen our understanding of that person and undo many of our biases. Now, from a Christian perspective, you might say, okay, so when I cross over to the so-called other, well, then what do I do? And again, in the book, I look at the example of Jesus in what I call seeing the other, seeing the other. And I love this, Jesus seeing the other. We have a perfect example, and this is out of the scriptures. This is from Matthew's gospel. I love what this says. At the sight of the crowds, Jesus's heart was moved with pity for them because they were troubled and abandoned, like sheep without a shepherd. Whenever Jesus crossed over, he tried his best to really see the person, to understand them, and to empathize deeply with that person. I love Rembrandt as a painter, and he painted these 4 paintings of the gaze of Jesus. My favorite is the upper right-hand corner. I just think of Jesus gazing upon the other, right? And really seeing them and empathizing with their situation, maybe their grievance, maybe their struggle. Well, this whole idea of Jesus seeing the other corresponds well to one of my, I would say, favorite authors, and that is David Brooks. He's got a book that's coming out soon. And the subtitle of that is The Art of Seeing Others Deeply. The Art of Seeing Others Deeply. And Brooks is quoted here, "There is one skill at the center of any healthy family, company, classroom, community, university, I would say religious community or nation." He says, the ability to see someone else deeply, to know another person profoundly, to make them feel heard and understood. So we examine our conscience, we cross over, we try to see the other, and then looking at Jesus's example, we're invited to try to remain curious, to remain curious. Jesus was very curious throughout his ministry. In fact, it's amazing. Jesus was asked like 180 questions in his ministry, and almost every time he rarely responded with a direct answer. Many times he would respond to a question with another question, which elicited a deeper conversation, or he would respond to people with an image or a metaphor or a story, which then deepened that conversation. Jesus, even though as we as Christians believe is the Son of God and God himself, Jesus was curious. He always used questions to elicit a response, and so that he could learn from another person so they could articulate his perspective. I love this beautiful painting here by Henry Ossawa Tanner. It is Jesus sitting down with Nicodemus, right? And I think that the colors within this painting just bespeak a situation of curiosity, like one person sitting next to another, right? Listening and asking questions and truly trying to understand the other's perspective, seeing the humanity in the person, and then letting that person speak from their own position and talking about their own story. Of course, one person that I'm pretty sure most of you all know, Monica Guzman, writes this wonderful book on curiosity, really. She's talking about having fearlessly curious conversations in a polarized world, right? And I love Guzman's work, and I use it in my own work, and I was honored that she was willing to endorse my work. But Guzman has this great thing which has changed me, and I've used this a lot. She says, have a curious question available with you. Why? Well, because you're going to be encountering all these difficult situations, maybe tensile situations, strange situations, especially if you choose to cross over. Somebody might say something that really rattles you. Well, rather than get defensive in that moment, ask the curious question. Can you tell me more about that? Can you help me understand what you're saying? Can you tell me your story? and how you've come to know what you know in your life. And so many times I have found that this actually works for me in these situations. So we cross over, we see the person, we remain curious. And then the next thing I say is, well, then what are we supposed to do, right? So how do we respond? And I love what Jesus holds up for us as an example here. And this is the idea of flexibility or adaptability. What do I mean by that? So sometimes people, as Christians, will say to me, oh, Jesus, he responded in singular ways to his audiences. And I say, well, I think the evidence is quite different, right? And look at this diagram here. So when Jesus encountered these vast array of people in many different situations, sometimes he just listened. Oftentimes, he taught his crowds. Sometimes he challenged people, and there's a place for that. And many times he was influenced, or he even learned about their experience, right? We can use that word with a little nuance. Sometimes he was just quiet. He was silent, even in the face of his persecutors. And sometimes his silence maybe wasn't beneficial to him, but he felt it was the best way to respond for the other person. So he was quiet. He sacrificed for the other person. He allowed himself to be sometimes humiliated, right? He walked into awkward situations, or he was vulnerable. And sometimes he brought healing and a fullness of life. We might call this, from a Christian perspective, he brought the fullness of a kind of salvific moment, depending on the situation. I love this painting here because it really depicts a situation of Jesus's own adaptability. This is a modern depiction of the Canaanite woman coming to Jesus. So the Canaanites, again, from a kind of Judeo-Christian perspective, were sort of the outsider. And Jesus is walking along with his disciples, and this is a woman who crosses over to Jesus, and she sort of pleads with him, and he kind of dismisses her. He's not really interested in her. He says, I have to do other things. And then she pleads again. And what does Jesus do? He adapts to the situation, and he uses this woman's faith to teach the disciples, right? So he uses an outsider's perspective to teach the insider. And I love that play between the insider and the outsider. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it shows Jesus's flexibility. So a lot of research on polarization is writing about the theme of flexibility, and I would point people to the work of Peter T. Coleman. He writes this book called The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. He's a professor up at Columbia University. He's doing all kinds of research around conversations and how do you navigate difficult situations and difficult themes, and how do you get through conflict. And he holds up the theme of flexibility or adaptability. And there are a lot of questions that he allows us to think about. And they're really important, I think, for all of us who are interested in navigating a polarized world and deepening unity. He says, ask the question, am I willing to learn? Because if I'm willing to learn, then when I cross over to the other, I can adapt to what the person is going to say. I feel like I have something really, truly to gain from the person. Can I live in ambiguous spaces? This is really tough, right? We're always in ambiguous spaces. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond. It's like me sitting down at the breakfast table before I've had my coffee at a Bravers Angels convention, right? What do you do when you sit across with a person that says, I really don't like Catholic priests? I mean, it's not an easy place to be in, but could I be flexible? Could I be adaptable, as Coleman talks about? Can I be open to various outcomes? I think that's really important. Do I have to manipulate a situation and push it in a direction, or can I be open to different things happening? Can I be patient? Can I adjust my views? Very much related to my willingness to learn, right? Am I too rigid in my perspectives? Is there a way to pursue nuance, right? To pursue more complex ideas of the world we live in? Can I be persistent? A lot like the Canaanite woman, right? So it's okay to have a conversation and then leave it be, and then to come back again and try something different. Ultimately, flexibility, I call it, I say it's creating space inside of myself for the other person, so that when I cross over, when I see them, when I'm curious, then I can open up and really receive that person and what he or she has to offer. The last thing then, and this is the last part that I do in my book and the last resource I'll hold up, and I think this is vital for anybody who's involved in the work of depolarization, anybody who's really doing the work of crossing over, which I know so many Braver Angels people are, and that is the Christian idea, which is shared by others, to remain hopeful, Hope and to see hopeful examples and hopeful situations is so important, because we can easily get discouraged. And one of the best things that I found in my research is to find all of these organizations and people that are doing this work. And I was inspired, and I continue to be inspired by them. And there's a lot of photos here, a lot of pictures here, but these are people that have inspired me. And I can't obviously go into all of them, but there's saints here from the Christian tradition, and there are living people who are, I would say, are kind of saintly. They're inspirational. They're virtuous. So we have Saint Francis up in the left corner, right? Who crossed over at a time when everybody was at war between Christians and Muslims. He crossed over to the Muslims in order to engage the leadership. And they had a deep conversation and dialogue. What a beautiful thing. And both people were changed by that. He had the ability to imagine a new way. We have Daryl Davis, who's the African-American man in the left-hand corner, who's converted over like 200 Ku Klux Klan members to leave the Klan, right? What an amazing thing as a Black man to go to Klan rallies and to invite people to be friends with them, to then invite them to sort of turn away from that life. And Monica Guzman's picture there, Dorothy Day, Amy Ullman in the center there in the blue. She's a professor at Georgetown. She's working on depolarizing within the classroom, which I think is such an important thing in our age. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, who talks a lot about stuff related to social media and the internet. Of course, Thomas Aquinas in the upper right-hand corner, who was this intellectual giant who, no matter who was speaking or no matter where the truth came from, he was a person open to truth and beauty and goodness, no matter what the source. Especially from the outsider. What a beautiful way to be challenged today. And then Chris Arnatti in the bottom corner. Chris was the person who was encouraged not to go to particular cities or places within cities or towns because people said, stay away. You have nothing to gain from doing that. And he said, no, I'm going to be curious. And he walked into these places, and he would just walk around and ask people questions and get to know them and learn from the wisdom that they have to share. So to remain hopeful in a polarized world. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and the last screen should come up here. I really appreciate it. There's obviously much more that I could say about the book, but those are kind of some of the highlights and some of the resources. And so I'll stop sharing my screen at this time, and then we can open it up. Lee will be hosting a number of questions, which I really look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you very much, Father Aaron. We'll now open the meeting for questions and discussion. I'd like to ask people to keep your remarks brief so that many people can have a chance to participate, and we may not have time for all questions. We apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. During this open time, please observe these Zoom protocols. Keep yourself muted unless you're actually speaking. Use your Zoom hand to indicate that you have a question or comment. The Zoom hand is the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer or desktop, or behind the three dots menu if you're on a tablet. And you can also type questions into the chat window, and we'll try to introduce that into the discussion. So to get started, let me ask a question of my own, then I'll take a couple from our library team, and then go to the audience. Father Aaron, in reading your book, I was really struck hard by the similarity of the principles and methods taught at Braver Angels workshops with the wisdom from religious figures, especially from the Christian tradition you described in your book. Coincidentally, I just finished co-organizing a group that did the depolarizing within workshop, and you referred to that. What do you think are the key messages that you would highlight that would resonate with the secular readers who may not be familiar with those people in the Christian tradition?
Yeah, that's really a great question. So I think one of the first messages that I think resonates with people would refer back to this whole idea of crossing over. You could also call that, bridging the divides. My experience has been, and I know others have experienced this, and then a lot of research has touched on this, that really does make a difference. So our openness and our willingness to identify a group that we maybe have a difficult time understanding, that maybe we feel like we do have biases or prejudice against, to actually cross over into a setting where we might be around those people. And depending on the relationship we have and perhaps how strong of feelings we have, many times it's good to have a facilitated setting where, like what Braver Angels does, to hold an event that intentionally brings these groups together, really works hard on, balancing the group makeup, really works hard on sort of talking about what are kind of respectful principles that we can hold so that we're treating the other with dignity, and then modeling in those moments how to have important conversations and even debates, how to listen, like how to really hear another person and try your best to reflect back to them, what you have heard. So I love that, like inherent within the Christian tradition, at least how I read it, is this whole idea of crossing over, and that resonates, I think, with people when it comes to bridging the divides, and that can be very successful. The second thing that I would say, and this refers a little bit back to Thomas Aquinas, but I would just talk about this is the general lowercase c Catholic tradition. So the idea of being Catholic means to be a person who looks at the whole of reality and tries to find within that reality wisdom and goodness and truth and beauty, no matter where that comes from. Because from the Catholic Christian tradition, we would say, well, those ultimately we would say they're gifts from God. And so no matter where there's goodness or wisdom or truth or beauty, we really should be open to that and to be overjoyed from that and open to learn from the other. And I think when Catholics, and I just speak for myself, when I have been my best, I've been a person who truly seeks out wisdom, no matter where the source, no matter where it's found. And I think this whole Catholic spirit, you might just call it a curious spirit or a kind of an open spirit to an extent. I think that this translates well, to the challenge that we all, I think, are feeling today. We can't just stay within silos and stay within echo chambers. We know that can produce very negative results. There's a lot of group psychology, social psychology around that when that happens, we become less and less diverse in our thought. There can be a very strong tendency to have us versus them mentalities. That's kind of like the default mentality whenever we begin to form groups, even with very minimal identity markers, which is really a fascinating kind of thing about who we are as humans. But the Catholic mind is to say, no, if I'm a Republican, I really need to try to hear and understand what the Democrat is saying. And that's really important. And the other thing is with that is to hear their story and how the person's come to know, what they know, because all of that humanizes the person. And in fact, we have so much to learn. I mean, that's just been my case. When I sat down with the Wiccan, the atheist, and the person who didn't really feel comfortable with Catholic priest, I learned something in each one of those situations. And had I not had that curious perspective, which I don't always have, no doubt about it, if I had not had that perspective, I really would have missed out. So I just love, and I would just hold those two things up at this point, and we can go to other questions. But that whole idea of crossing over, which is about bridging the divides, and then the whole idea of Catholicity, remaining open and really curious to see where is there wisdom around me and how can I incorporate that into my own experience of life and reality.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask the library team, first Dan and then Barbara. Dan, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Father Westman, for the book and for your presentation here tonight. I really enjoyed the chapter where you go into the curiosity and flexibility and prudence. And I also learned a new term of salvific encounter. And it struck me that some people might take that as a call to evangelicism. I would want to save others through my point of view. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that term and how you might counsel somebody that saw that as a call to be evangelical about their position.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a great question. So for me, in any case, I think one real good way to understand the Christian idea of salvation is to sort of look at it holistically. So what I try to break down in the book is to sort of say, salvation is really about what we call the fullness of life. And so anytime I think in a person's life, whether you're explicitly Christian or not, anytime that you're growing in the fullness of life. So you could talk about the hierarchy of needs, right? So having your basic needs met, having a wonderful source of community and family, having friendships, having a purpose and meaning in life, having some connection to a higher power or another, and then kind of moving up to where we might talk about where you have a religious participation. To me, that's all involved in this salvific encounter, so that when we are encountering each other as human beings, it's all about a mutual exchange. We're all trying to share with each other as best as we can. I'm receiving what you're giving to me, and hopefully I can share my own experience or my own perspective with that person. It might be that you're sharing with me bread because I don't have bread to eat. It might be that I'm sharing with you a place to stay for the evening because you don't have shelter. That to me is what I would call a moment of a salvific encounter. We're helping each other live the fullness of life as we move through the hierarchy of needs. And I do think that there are moments where, if I'm sitting across the table from somebody who's a Buddhist at a Braver Angels convention, I would hope that I would be open to listen to that person's experience of Buddhism and how that's touched their life, and hear their story. And if they have wisdom to share with me, I think that would be good for me to be open to that and to understand how that can be incorporated into my life. And then likewise, if there's a true mutuality in that relationship, I would hope at some time that I could share with that Buddhist person, my own experience of faith in Jesus Christ within Catholicism, and how that's meaningful to me, and so on and so forth. And as we kind of go along, my idea is we're all trying to deepen our experience of life. And for some, it might be in that conversation, they're really attracted to Buddhism and that's the path that they end up taking. And for others, they might say, oh, I'm really interested in learning more about Catholicism and the church. And, a person would be welcomed into that situation without being coerced and without being forced. Because again, it's about recognizing the dignity in the other person and respecting that, and offering invitation, but really having that mutual exchange where freedom is respected. So thank you for that great question.
Okay, let's hear from Barbara and then Rita.
Yes, Father Aaron, I really, really liked your book a lot, and I got so much out of it. But I wonder if you have any suggestions for, I'm not Catholic, but I am Christian. And when I try to talk to my Christian friends to convey the concepts of Braver Angels, like I was at the convention. So like you sit with all these different people. But do you have any suggestions how you answer fellow Christians who say, well, I can't do that. I can't sit and talk and find this common ground because I have to say, these are the truths of God's word, and I'm supposed to be proclaiming these truths. And if I just have these discussions, it's really compromising what I'm supposed to be doing by, giving out the truth. Do you have any suggestions how you answer people like that?
So this isn't shameless self-promotion, but I share this because a number of people have asked me that same question. They said, I've really been challenged. I have these friends or family members, and I'm just not sure kind of how to move in the right direction with these folks. And so a number of people have actually purchased like 5 or 6 books and said, can we at least walk through this book together? And it's amazing because the book provides that, like, you can kind of make fun of me or whatever, like you use me as the foil. And so if people want to like say, oh, I'm not sure if he knows what he's talking about or whatever, but you can do that. So it provides a certain sense of neutrality, but it's also, it provides like a similar text. And I tried my best to really utilize the scriptures. Like, so I feel like, though I speak from a Catholic perspective, I tried to be very Christ-centered within the books, because I know I really have a lot of wonderful evangelical friends and non-Catholic Christian friends that I had them somewhat in mind, and I had them read through the book too as I was writing. So I try my best to say, look, let's just look at what Jesus provides us as an example, right? And I particularly like the idea of flexibility, because even Jesus himself, he did not use his teachings as a kind of weapon to beat over the heads of people. he sometimes was pretty hard on the so-called Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees. Okay, so that's certainly there, and I talked about that, right? But many ways, he just listened to people. He told stories. He listened to their story. He asked them what they wanted. He asked them what was meaningful in their life, and he built relationships with people. And so I think it was in building that relationship, then they were actually able to share something, and he could share something with them, which really touched their hearts. So I think the book kind of moves into that, I think, looking at the example of Jesus. And then I would just say the last thing, which has been good for me. You think of in my own life, who have the people been who've been really influential? Has it been, a random person on a street corner who kind of came up to me as I was trying to get on the subway and I was in a hurry and, tried to give me a Bible verse? That's not really been super helpful in my own life. The things that have really influenced me and changed me, helped me into the depths of wisdom, let's say, have been folks who have become friends of mine and mentors and built a relationship with me and established a kind of trust and, established an understanding, and they gave me space, right? So when I wasn't sure about something and when I was uncomfortable, they didn't push me, right? But they gave me space, and they allowed, in a sense, my needs to kind of dictate the conversation. So again, I think that's another way of saying prudence is important, but also that relationship really is important, and inviting people to give others space rather than kind of pushing something on them. So I hope that helps. It's not easy by any means. So it's a great question.
Let's hear from Rita and then John.
Okay. Hi, Father Aaron. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I believe that you and I may have met in Gettysburg. Had the pleasure of meeting you there. And I really appreciate what you're talking about tonight. One of the things, when I came into Braver Angels, I was not political whatsoever when I came into Braver Angels. I lost a friendship of 50 years, which was very, very hurtful. Totally unexpected. I mean, it really caught me blindsided. And that was when I actually started really realizing that the United States was in the bad position that it was. And I really had a difficult time because I grew up in a very humble home with an Italian mother and a non-practicing Methodist father. And the main thing that I had been taught as a child and through the church too was that we were to love others. And of course, love is defined by different people in different ways. But when you're a follower of Christ, we try to emulate and we try to learn from Christ what love means. And so for me, I was kind of taken aback when I realized that there were Christians that were angry at other Christians or even the non-believers within their families or whatever. And I had a very difficult time with that initially. Now, since coming to Braver Angels, I've come to understand it more. But one of the things that, I, as a Catholic growing up, naturally, we didn't study the scriptures like Protestants do. Now I'm 65 years old. That's changed a lot. Now we have Bible studies, but it was the Protestant brothers and sisters that actually I learned how to study the scriptures from. When the Pharisees asked Jesus, what is the most important commandment? Of course, we know that they were playing with him, right? Trying to trip him up, so to speak. And he says to them, the most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second one is just like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So my confusion, Barbara, thank you for your comments, because those are some of the things that has confused me very much. When you don't know another person, only God knows the depths of that person's soul. And it's not up to me to decide. I'm supposed to be an instrument of love to that other person. It's not up to me to decide, oh, well, they I don't know them. I know how they voted maybe, but that doesn't say anything to me about the complexity of who they are as a human being.
Rita, could I ask you to
Sure,
Take on the
sure.
question, yeah. Mhm.
Sure. So that is my question, I guess, just and anybody else that wants to help me verbalize it. But how is it that Christians who claim to, that Christ is that God is the one they look to, how can they say, oh, well, I shouldn't be associating with that person? Christ did it all the time. I mean, those were the very people that Christ associated with. And that's how we show others his love, is by accepting them right where they're at, and learning from them also. So my question is, how do we share that message in a loving way?
Yeah, Rita, I really appreciate your comments and your personal stories that you shared. And, I think, that's one of the real challenges, I think, for Christians in the United States would be to really take a deep look at our lives and then the tradition that we've been given, particularly in the Gospels and the example of Jesus, and say, first of all, it's a matter of knowing, right? So do I know how I'm supposed to live, right? And then of course there's the struggle with the will, and that's another challenge, right? So I might know it, but I just can't do it, right? So it's very complex, to be sure. And I would just say, it is a lifelong process of conversion, and we pray for the grace to sort of deepen that experience. And also the great thing is, others are being moved to grow too. Others are being moved to grow too. Megan Phelps Roper was part of the Westboro Baptist Church, and she has this great kind of experience that people couldn't understand why she was part of a group that seemed to be so hate-filled, but people stood close to her even if they didn't really agree with her. They didn't agree with her. And she said, the greatest people for me during that time were the ones that didn't desert me at that time. And that's a powerful thing, right? And so today she's now a different person. So hanging with people and being there for the long haul is really important. So thank you.
John.
Yeah, hi, Father Wessman. I'm really enjoying your book. I'm almost at the end, like next to the last chapter. And the question I've had from the beginning and from the title, and I still have it, is when you use the word church, capital C, are you talking about the Roman Catholic Church or Christianity in general?
Yeah, so it's a big ecclesiological question, and I would say that I'm trying to be as inclusive as I can of the Church of Christ as possible. And at least from my ecclesiological presuppositions, I believe that there really is just one Church of Christ. And we would say that would subsist within the Catholic Church, and yet that doesn't diminish the lived reality of Christianity by other groups and people. So I see the great value in that, and emphasize the importance of that. And I'm always hoping and praying and working towards deeper Christian unity, not uniformity, but actually deeper Christian unity. So I'm very committed to the movement of ecumenism, that is to try to deepen unity amongst Christians. So, I could perhaps be more ecclesiologically specific within the book. I'm trying to say, I think this is a challenge for the church in general. And then within the book, I do say, however, I'm not super comfortable speaking on behalf of evangelical Christians. I'm not super comfortable, and I'm not even knowledgeable enough to speak on behalf of, for instance, like Lutherans or Presbyterians and so on and so forth. So I certainly am stepping off from Catholic presuppositions, but I still think what I have to say, for what it's worth, I think it could be offered to others, as valuable, no matter what Christian tradition they're hailing from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
And Lee, there is a question in the chat. I don't know if you saw it.
Yes, I may be reading out of order, but let me just read the last one that I'm looking at here. There's a question. Could we ask Father Aaron if, that's more of a bit of a specific one, and maybe we should connect that during the connection part, the networking part. But it's a question about would you be available to speak at a diocese? So maybe we need to handle that offline. Are there other questions in the chat? It doesn't look like it. Okay.
Lee, there
There was a
is,
question.
there is. If you look at Frank Sade, there's one down a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Frank says, thank you for peacemaking insights, and I will be buying the book this evening. Well, you've got a book sale. Several of my from my extended family. Have you ever run into a situation where crossing over is not possible, or is there a time to back off?
Yeah, that's a really actually very important and wonderful question. And so I try to talk about the one I couldn't fit it into the presentation because I knew I just wanted to be respectful for time, but I do talk about prudence. And I think the idea of prudence to me and how I use it in the book is that, we need to assess the situations that we encounter. And I think we need to try to say, what am I being called to do? I would use that kind of Christian language, but what should I do in this situation that's going to bring about the most good for all of the people involved? And I think there are many situations, and I know these for myself personally, where the best thing that I can do is not cross over. Okay, so I might have gotten up on the wrong side of the bed. I might not have had my 10 gallons of coffee in the morning. I might have had a really difficult situation. I might be experiencing some pain or grief or loss. It takes a great amount of vulnerability and courage and persistence to keep crossing over. So I think we really need to, I need to be in the right place emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, mentally, intellectually to actually do the work of crossing over. So prudence is very important, and from a Christian perspective, I think others would say this too. It's also a matter of sort of talking about, what is God calling me to do in this situation? We might say, what's the Holy Spirit leading? But of course, other traditions believe in God and some of the providence of God. So what is God calling me? And that's this is my own, I write about in the book, but we have to be very careful with that, right? Because we can get into dangerous situations where we say, well, God's telling me to do this. Well, we have to be careful with that, but to really just discern well, and really think, what do I need to do in this particular situation? And sometimes it's, I can't talk to this sibling of mine. It's too hard right now, but maybe it'll be better some other time. So thank you for that great question. And I really appreciate it. And maybe just to say, Lee, I'm more than willing to speak with groups if people are interested. That would be an honor for me. And whatever I could do to offer resources to people in our present context, I'm open to that.
I'll definitely make the connection here after the meeting, and yes. Okay, are there other questions from the audience? We're running close to the end of time. We do have a time for one or two more questions. If not, I'll ask.
There is another one in the chat from Dennis.
There is?
From Dennis?
Okay, from Dennis. Hello, Dennis. Is there and Dennis says, is there a nation where there isn't a lot of polarization? Good question. What is the church doing in that nation that what in that nation that is and isn't doing in America? So differences between the church in America and other countries.
So I really don't feel qualified to answer that question. When I set out to do the study on polarization, I really had to stay focused on a particular cultural context. And so I really looked specifically at the United States and focused here. I've heard anecdotally what's going on in different contexts. And so I know I'm doing something with Canada next week. So they're saying to me, yeah, what we're experiencing here is very similar to what's going on in the United States. And so it's great for me to be in that context and learn from them. So I think, you can think about in Christian context where there's been a lot of division, you might say, like with the troubles in Ireland and truth and reconciliation, you might think about South Africa and truth and reconciliation. You might think about, I've heard some really interesting presentations on, what people have had to do post genocide in Rwanda. And I mean, I am moved by the way people are working through intense sadness and grief and loss and anger and hatred because of, one of their neighbors killed another neighbor or killed somebody from their family. And so there's a lot I think we can learn from those contexts. So I think it's great to learn about that, and I'd be more than open to receiving resources from people if they have them on that.
I'm going to take one more question, then it is running after our planned quitting time, and I don't want to abuse people's time here. If you feel like we want to devote more time in future book club discussions, that might be a good feedback item for us during that part of the, anyway. Let me hear from Amy Teutenberg, and then we'll start wrapping our meeting up. Amy, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, Father. Sorry, my video's not working. So, and I met you at the conference briefly. What do we do when so if we do cross over with people that may be part of, like the LGBTQ community, eventually, if they do ask, we're going to have to be honest, what our catechism says, and they're going to be very offended by that. So, I mean, do you have any tips for that?
I mean, you could maybe provide a similar experience. So I did what we would call clinical pastoral education, where you go into a hospital system and you do chaplaincy work. And this was while I was still in the seminary, and I did that up in New York City. And so in my immediate group of cohort, there were people from various Jewish backgrounds, from different Protestant backgrounds, and I think I was the singular Catholic. And we built deep relationships, and you really walk through difficult moments in CPE. And we had some very different perspectives on some of the most important issues related to people in their lives, sexuality and anthropology. And what you're saying is very challenging. I feel like if you have the relationship, then you can say, I really care about you, and you're important to me, and I feel like I really need to speak from my perspective, because it's to be true to myself, and I don't say this in any way to be hurtful or mean, and or any way, but I feel like I need to say this because it is a part of who I am. And then sometimes in life, and this is the thing that, especially in the last year or so working on polarization, I've seen, sometimes life is just about living with irreconcilable tension. And that is not an easy thing for me to do. And I imagine it's not easy for other people as well. So thank you for that question.
Okay.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are coming to a close, and we've had a very good discussion. I'd strongly encourage any of our audience who have not had the opportunity to read the full text of the book to do so. The first part is really a compact but comprehensive overview of the problems and causes of polarization. You'll find it a great reference. And the second part is, of course, full of Father Aaron's personal insights and many, many more than we've had a chance to talk to discuss today. So I strongly encourage you to read the book. I'd like to thank our staff and our audience, and especially Father Aaron, for sharing his time with us. And at this point, I would like to ask the audience to stay for a few more minutes. There is some information I want to share with you about Braver Angels, but also give you a chance to contact other members of this audience. If you've heard anything that interests you and you want to reach out and get in touch with we'll provide you an opportunity to do that. So thank you, Father Aaron. It's been great, and we look forward maybe to talking to you again.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you to you all. This has been a wonderful evening. Take care.